días.
El Instituto de Investigaciones Filológicas y la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México les da la más cordial bienvenida a una edición más del ciclo Grandes protagonistas de las Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, con la conferencia magistral titulada Doing Feminism from the Global South. Presiden este acto, en representación del director de nuestra facultad, doctor Alejandro Chanona, el doctor Eric del Ángel Landeros, secretario de Desarrollo Académico de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. La doctora Mónica Amilpas García, secretaria técnica de la Unidad de Género de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. Y la doctora Nivedita Menon, conferencista magistral del día de hoy. Welcome. Muchas gracias a todas por su distinguida presencia. Nos complace también contar con la asistencia de estudiantes, profesoras, profesores, funcionarios, coordinadoras y coordinadores de los centros de estudio de nuestra facultad, así como de las personas que nos acompañan a través de las redes sociales. Sean todas y todos ustedes bienvenidos. Para dar inicio a este evento, escucharemos un mensaje en la voz del doctor Eric del Ángel Landeros.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días a todas y todos. Reciban un saludo en nombre del director de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, el doctor Alejandro Chanona, que posiblemente nos acompañará en unos minutos. Está en unas diligencias importantes de nuestra facultad. Y también queremos saludar especialmente a nuestra conferencista magistral, la profesora Nivedita Menon. Welcome to our university and to the School of Political and Social Science community. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being here today. It's an honor for us having you here. Agradezco también profundamente al Instituto de Investigaciones Filológicas y a su directora, la doctora Lilian Álvarez Arellano, por recibirnos en este magnífico auditorio. Saludo con gusto a la doctora Mónica Amilpas, titular de la Unidad de Género de la Facultad, quien presentará y moderará esta conferencia en unos minutos. Gracias, Mónica. Así como a la comunidad de la facultad y de la UNAM, que se da cita hoy aquí y que también nos sigue por las redes sociales en la transmisión que tenemos. Con la presentación de la doctora Menon, la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales enriquece el ciclo de conferencias en conmemoración de su 75 aniversario, que se titula Grandes protagonistas de las Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. En estas conferencias magistrales se abordan los debates contemporáneos en administración pública, antropología, ciencias de la comunicación, ciencia política, relaciones internacionales y sociología, así como temas transversales fundamentales para nuestras disciplinas, como el feminismo, el cual hoy será objeto de una disertación profunda y enriquecedora. El ciclo Grandes protagonistas de las Ciencias Políticas y Sociales reúne a científicas y científicos sociales de todo el mundo para compartir el conocimiento y reflexiones que han construido a lo largo de sus décadas de destacadas carreras, reafirmando la centralidad de nuestra facultad como semillero de formación e investigación, significándose como una institución de vanguardia internacional en las ciencias políticas y sociales. Es un verdadero privilegio contar con la presencia de la doctora Menon, quien visita por primera vez nuestro país. Nos da mucho gusto también que esta sea su primera experiencia aquí en México. Sus aportes a la teoría y el debate de los feminismos ha sido fundamental en distintas partes del mundo, ofreciendo una visión multicultural incluyente sobre el papel de las mujeres en sociedades desiguales como la nuestra. La profesora Menon Es un referente obligado en estudios de interseccionalidad, teoría social, género y feminismo. Propone utilizar el feminismo como una perspectiva crítica para desnaturalizar las instituciones y relaciones sociales, familia, género, sexualidad, trabajo, violencia y Estado. Revelar las relaciones de poder que las sostienen y abrir posibilidades para transformarlas. El feminismo que propone la doctora Menon busca incidir en el campo social de manera que las antiguas categorías y fronteras dejen de parecer naturales. Asimismo, incorpora de manera relevante las luchas LGTBIQ+, y cuestiona la idea de que el feminismo pueda reducirse a la relación entre hombres y mujeres heterosexuales. A continuación, nuestra distinguida invitada dictará la conferencia Doing Feminism from the Global South, y como quizás su libro más reconocido lo menciona, Sing Like a Feminist, les invito a ponerse los prismas feministas, no solo los próximos minutos, sino toda su vida. Muchas gracias a todas y todos. Por mi raza hablará el espíritu.
Agradecemos el mensaje del doctor Eric del Ángel Landeros y a continuación damos el uso de la voz a la doctora Mónica Amilpas García, secretaria técnica de la Unidad de Género de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, quien presentará a nuestra distinguida conferencista magistral y conducirá el diálogo correspondiente.
Muchas gracias, buenos días. Damos la cordial bienvenida a la doctora Menon. Doctora, gracias por estar aquí. Thank you for here and share your ideas with our community. La doctora Menon compartirá algunas ideas con nuestra comunidad universitaria. Creo que esta conferencia resultará muy inspiradora por todos los temas que va a tratar y sobre todo la perspectiva con la que aborda el sur global. Pues sin más preámbulo, le doy el uso de la voz a la doctora Menon. Doctora, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Monica. I'm deeply honored. Before I say all that, let me just put my PowerPoint on. And then I would do this to change. Okay, starting all over again. Thank you so much. I'm truly deeply honored to be invited to come so far from Delhi on my very first visit to your exciting country, to this exciting city. And I'm deeply, deeply honored to be invited to speak on this very special occasion, celebrating UNAM's 75th anniversary. I congratulate you all on this occasion and would like to once again express my deepest gratitude for giving me this opportunity to be here in Mexico City with all of you. As you can see from the title of my lecture, we will use the term doing feminism rather than being feminist, because I prefer to see feminism as a set of practices that take different shapes in different contexts, rather than something that essentially constitutes the self. Of course, I would call myself feminist, but that identity is produced by my understanding and practices, not by some internal core. In claiming feminism in this way, I draw on feminisms of the Global South that have been suspicious of the idea of a universal subject of feminism, woman. Rather, any mainstream feminism that claimed universal woman has been challenged in the Global South as representing the dominant identity of that region, caste, by race, by class. So what we have experienced in the Global South are multiple feminisms in every context that arose simultaneously, initially as struggles against imperialism as well as against patriarchy. The images are mainly so that you don't feel bored staring at my face for an hour. It was just my attempt to give you a slightly easier one now. I will address two interlinked themes in this lecture. First, the challenge to the idea of a universal feminist subject, and second, the contestations over the value of modernity. So let's start with the challenges to the idea of a universal feminist subject. And let's start with the understanding that to do feminism at all, one has to reject the codes that make the world appear reasonable, make the world meaningful. Because the maintaining of social order requires the faithful performance of prescribed rituals over and over again throughout one's lifetime. Complex networks of cultural reproduction are dedicated to this sole purpose. And the ultimate goal of all this unceasing activity is to produce the effect of untouched naturalness. When one tries to do feminism, however, one looks at the world with a feminist gaze. And this gaze undoes social order, reveals the strenuous, complex formatting that goes on below the surface of what looked smooth and complete. And what do I mean by feminism? A feminist perspective recognizes that the hierarchical organizing of the world around gender is key to maintaining social order, that to live lives marked as male and female is to live different realities. But simultaneously, to be a feminist is to imagine occupying the marginal, relatively powerless position with reference to every dominant framework that swallows up space at the center. For instance, most of the women in a room like this, let's say, right, university professionals of different sorts, teachers, faculty, we would be in a relatively powerful position with regard to working class men that we interact with daily, the taxi driver, the janitor, in India, the domestic servant. And in India, if the woman is a dominant caste Hindu or a white American anywhere, then she would be relatively powerful with regard to men who are not dominant caste or white. At the same time, she would experience her relative powerlessness as a woman if faced by a man in a position to attack her sexually, regardless of his class or caste position, or when she compares her life choices and autonomy with those of a man of her class. Needless to say, it's not only women who can adopt feminism as a political stance and way of life, but men who choose to do this have to be taking a stand against the privileges that they would otherwise take for granted. Feminism is thus not about individual men and women, but about understanding the ways in which men, a category called men and a category called women, are produced and inserted into patriarchies that differ according to time and place. So I wanted to just start with this kind of very brief account of what I mean when I use the term feminism, because as I'm sure you're all aware, that's one of the points that I'm making, that there are multiple ways of being feminist and understanding feminism. I have tried to arrive at an understanding that enables us to think about being feminist in different contexts. And I would say the key element that holds it all together is that when we look at a settled social order, we immediately try to understand what makes that order look so settled. What is the work that has gone into keeping that order? Now, what do we mean by the Global South? So these are the two terms of my title that I want to quickly unpack first. The way I see it, invoking the Global South is also a gesture against universalizing the subject. The term Global South does not here refer to a geographical region, nor to a category within a developmental discourse. It is intended to indicate a space of thought. It's a conceptual space. It enables the possibility of revaluing and learning from speech that exists in the margins, of reworking the coordinates of intellectual labor to free ourselves from the Eurocentric universalizing narratives, to destabilize the East-West distinction that is routinely made in the context of thought and intellection. What happens when we conceptualize the Global South in this way is that spaces within the geographical Global North could be part of the Global South. For instance, the thought of African Americans in the United States of America, of indigenous people in the Americas and Australia. This could also apply perhaps to some parts of Europe, around the Mediterranean, for example, if you think of that part of the world, as parts of Eastern and Central Europe have histories that cut through all neat continental divisions. The supposedly natural division of this part of the world into continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, is anything but natural. Spatially, North Africa, West Asia, and Southern Europe think of the map around the Mediterranean, are more contiguous with one another than with other parts of their continents. Moreover, as scholars of oceanic studies have pointed out, oceans which are now thought of, or at least from the 20th century being thought of as water that separates pieces of land, scholars of oceanic studies have shown how oceans have acted as conduits of communication. And in other spheres too, long hidden or conveniently invisible connections between the three discursively separated continents around the Mediterranean have been made visible. Now, I just want to note here in passing that the term Global South for now, I'm using it, but it assumes certain histories of normalized cartography as well, which are challenged by strategies such as the first image that you saw in my title. This is the work of, I wanted to show it again. That is the artist, the Uruguayan artist Torres Garcia, who made this work in 1943, and he is famous for this manifesto, the School of the South Manifesto, which was written, Our North is the South, in 1935. So what I'm trying to say is that when we say Global South, I'm assuming for now, I'm not questioning for now, the strategies of cartography which have certain protocols of how to represent a globe, a sphere, on a flat surface. Now, we're calling this the upside-down map, but you know very well it is not upside down because the globe is round. It's just simply inverting our idea of how the map is represented. So there's nothing upside down about this map. It's just another, if you actually go above the earth and look down, you could well see the earth like this. So I do want to just note in passing that I'm using the term Global South referring to the maps that we're all familiar with. But if there was a hyperlink, the hyperlink would take us to discussing the ways in which the politics of cartography works. And if you have any questions about that at the end, I'm very happy to go into it, but that would take us in a different direction. So for now, I will simply say that I'm assuming certain normalized histories of cartography. Now, I have found the work of Walter Mignolo quite productive in trying to understand the Global South. And he asserts, I am where I think, which is a very interesting way of thinking about thinking, because what he's saying is that you constitute yourself, I am, in the place where you do and think. I read this statement not as a claim to ahistoric indigeneity or authenticity or superiority vis-a-vis the West, something called the West, which is a stance very familiar in my country from the Hindu nationalist framework, that we did everything first. So when you say, I am where I think, I want to insist that we're not producing some kind of indigenous superiority vis-a-vis the West. Rather, what we're doing is an insistence on privileging location, a recognition that spatial and temporal coordinates, that is where you are and what time you're occupying, spatial and temporal coordinates inevitably suffuse all theorizing. A sensitivity to location invariably leads to a productive contamination of the purity of empty universalist categories with specific histories, thus challenging their claim to speak about everywhere from nowhere, pointing towards unexpected other histories that unsettle the idea of a single point of origin. So when we talk about the Global South, as I said, you have the Global South within the Global North, which I referred to. This hemispheric divide is also bridged by links between two Souths. For example, Latin American decolonial feminism has found allies in the Latina, Latinx feminist tradition of the United States. This Latina, Latinx actually can capture a range of identities which cut across these two continents. In India, Dalit intellectuals, the term Dalit refers to militant reframing of an identity that was formerly untouchable. The formerly untouchable castes claimed it's like the term queer, for example, right? Queer was used as a term of abuse, but queer has been taken up as a badge of pride. Similarly, Dalit is a term like that. So I'll just say that if you want to. So it's a very common term in the Indian subcontinent. So we find that Dalit intellectuals in South Asia, so we're at this moment talking about the connections that South-South makes regardless of where you're located, because as I said, Global South is a conceptual space. So you have the Latin American decolonial feminism and the links with the Latinx feminist traditions of the United States. You have the Dalit intellectuals in South Asia who have been in conversation with Black politics and scholarship in the USA from the time of the correspondence between Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is one of the key figures of 20th century India in the shaping of India, and who was also a Dalit. And in fact, this term is assumed, one of the origins of this term is assumed to have come from him. So B.R. Ambedkar was in correspondence with W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I'm sure you're more familiar with, when Du Bois had submitted a petition to the UN on African Americans in the US, and Ambedkar was in touch with Du Bois because he hoped to follow Du Bois in submitting a petition to the UN on the plight of India's untouchables. You have the Dalit Panther organization, which was founded in India in 1972, which was explicitly inspired by the Black Panthers of the US, and for about 5 years at its peak, it provided inspiring and militant leadership to young Dalits. And you have today activists like Thenmozhi Sundararajan, founder of Equality Labs, who studies the practice of caste discrimination among South Asians in the USA. And they have made explicit connections between Dalit and Black experience. Another more recent alliance, so you see what we're trying to do here is trying to unpack the idea of the Global South to show that conceptually what kinds of connections and conversations have been possible and are possible in the future and are possible to conceive of imaginatively. A more recent alliance is between post-socialist and post-colonial feminisms. Medina Tlotsunova calls these uneasy affinities because on the one hand, post-socialist, this is just the cover of a very interesting book with a lot of interesting essays which you might find useful to read. On the one hand, post-socialist scholars are seen by post-colonial scholars as more aligned with the North. You see, hence uneasy affinities, because post-socialist countries are, after all, Eastern Europe, and post-colonial is Global South. But Medina Tlotsunova and her colleagues have offered us this concept of post-socialist precarity, referring to the geohistorical experiences resulting from the dismantling of state socialist modernity. And so this precarity of being in post-socialist regimes, which are also rapidly rolling back on the gains of the feminist movement in these places, it draws, she says, Tlotsunova says, it draws post-colonial and post-socialist feminists together in their shared critique of imperialism, capitalism, and heteronormativity. Racism tends to be less visible in the post-socialist imaginary, but the conversation with post-colonialism brings the issue of racialized hierarchies into focus. Now, it should be clear that I do not suggest that the South is homogeneous, nor is the North. The issues of heterogeneity, power, and dissent within the Global South, I've talked about caste, I've talked about race. The issues of heterogeneity, power, and dissent within the Global South tends to be addressed less by post-colonial and decolonial thinking, where the objects of critique remain empire and coloniality. However, feminist thinking must be alert to debates and contentions within the South in order to take seriously the heterogeneity and power relations internal to the South. Now, this brings us to the question of translation, because when we think of conversations of this sort, among different elements of the Global South present in the Global North, within the Global South, etc., the question of translation becomes important, not just translation between languages, but translations between conceptual universes. That is to say that if you take, let me take a simple term like the European Enlightenment, there is a word for that that is used in one of the languages of India, Hindi. So we would just say Prabodhan, but that simply translates the word enlightenment. It does not carry the weight of what enlightenment implies from the European point of view, right? That was the height, the achievement of some kind of special civilizational moment which the rest of the world has to try to catch up to. That is the story of the European Enlightenment. That's the autobiography of the European Enlightenment. So simply translating the word enlightenment to a Hindi word doesn't capture the weight of what it means. So that's what I mean, that translation is between conceptual universes. It's not simply finding a word for another word. So I'm going to give you an example of a striking instance of translation as appropriation. What happens? So translation can do different kinds of work. And again, that's another discussion we could have, especially since we're in the philology department. Translation can perform different kinds of work. It can build bridges, it can appropriate, it can transform and raise new issues. But I'm going to use a striking instance of translation as appropriation from the point of view of African feminist scholars, some African feminist scholars. I hope you understand that what I'm trying to do is not give you one point of view on feminism. I'm trying to show you that feminisms are disparate, heterogeneous, in conversation, in competition, in conflict. There are all these things that are happening. So some African feminists believe that the application of gender to African societies is problematic. They have pointed out how Western feminism has universalized the concepts of women and patriarchy, failing to see the actual very different structures of societal power in operation. Oironke Oiwumi, who you see on the screen now, has written this book called The Invention of Women. And she's a Nigerian feminist, and she argues that gender as a category did not operate in any significant way in pre-colonial Yoruba and many other African cultures. Western post-Enlightenment philosophy privileges appearance, seeing. This is one of the arguments she makes. This is an argument that has been made by many philosophers, that Enlightenment light is about seeing. So there's a privileging of the metaphor or the trope of sight, if you've come from the Enlightenment tradition. So what she's saying is that Western post-Enlightenment philosophy privileges appearance or seeing, and therefore the body assumes, and seeing the body, and therefore it assumes certain structures of social difference based on what bodies look like. Differences which are not visible to the eye in the same way are not understood, is what Oiwumi is saying. She cites a study on the Ga traders of Ghana that refers to them as market women. This is an American anthropologist who studies the Ga traders of Ghana and refers to them as market women. Drawing all its conclusions from this foundational premise, even when the identity of traders in West African societies, says Oiwumi, is not gender specific. Through her own work, so what she's saying is that there are people who happen to be traders, but when you look at them and you see women, you think of them as market women, but they are simply traders. This becomes almost impossible to understand in the concept of a Western framework where people are, the first thing you notice supposedly about people is whether they are male or female. Through her own work, Oiwumi argues that among the Yoruba, it is not gender which is the defining axis of hierarchy, but seniority. So she's not making, and one of the criticisms that's made of her is that she's saying, the Yoruba society was so egalitarian and so on. She's not saying there was no hierarchy. She's saying gender was not the principle of hierarchy. It was seniority, in which obviously women would also get higher or lower positions. These debates are very rich among feminists in Africa, and obviously I have access only to what I can read in English, but even that gives us so much to learn. For example, there's another scholar, Nkiru Nzegwu, through a critique of Martha Nussbaum and Ife Amadiume. Martha Nussbaum is an American philosopher, and Ife Amadiume is also from Nigeria. And Nzegwu shows how what she calls the metaphysics of gender erodes cultural specificity and the historicity of societies such as that of the Igbo. So she says that even Amadiume, a Nigerian scholar, as she struggles to produce a culturally grounded account of the position of women, is caught up in this metaphysics. Now, what is interesting, why she's saying this, is Amadiume talks about male daughters and female husbands. She's explaining that in this society, what happens is that in Igbo society, women perform sometimes the role of men, and men sometimes perform the role of women, hence female husbands and male daughters. But what Nzegwu is saying is that when she describes this fluidity, a flexible, fluid state of being, she says gender, that Nzegwu says, and that's what Amadiume is trying to say as well, that gender identity in Igbo society is a flexible, fluid state of being. But what happens when you try to explain it, when you translate it, we're talking about translation, when you translate it into terms that should be accessible globally, i.e. to the global north, you're using the same terms, right? When you say female husbands and male daughters, you're still assuming the binary of male-female. This is the argument that Nzegwu is making of Amadiume, that this is such exciting work, but she ends up getting trapped in that gender binary. Another important feminist voice from Africa is Sylvia Tamale, whose decolonization and African feminism, decolonization and Afrofeminism, this was published in 2020, sees as a key decolonial move the assertion of a reworked Pan-Africanism that is both decolonial and Afrofeminist. Tamale is critical of the Western human rights paradigm based on the fragmented individual. She proposes instead something that you all must have heard of by now, the African philosophy of Ubuntu from the Zulu language. I think many African scholars and many non-African scholars believe that Ubuntu has become a bit too accessible to statist discourses, and it's just used too easily. But I think there's still a way in which Ubuntu can be spoken of in a more disturbing way. So Ubuntu from the Zulu language thinks in interconnected terms, and Tamale says is better geared to social justice. So she contrasts, I think, therefore I am, the famous the Cartesian formulation, and she translates it as or she makes us understand Ubuntu as saying, I am because you are. That is, a person through other people. This idea echoes a theme characteristic of thought in the Global South, the discomfort or lack of identification with the individual as assumed by Western modernity. So this is a very brief account of a dense discussion among African scholars, offered here to indicate what it might mean to listen to internal conversations seriously. Here, when we talk about the Global South, I want to say that there are, I didn't mean to go into it, but I'm going to simply indicate that I think there are three tasks that we are faced with when we think of the Global South. One is, of course, a critique of Eurocentrism, and that task is pretty much well performed by now. The second is to question the East-West binary, because the West has been produced by long contact with the East, and the East since the 19th century has been produced by long contact with the West. So the idea that there are these two very specific forms of knowledge is also problematic. And the third, which is what I'm trying to, the task, which is now I think where we're at, is to try and listen to conversations and understand conversations in different contexts in the Global South. Learn what are the conceptual categories that are in use here? What is the debate? How do I relate to it? Do I relate to it at all, etc., right? I meaning from a particular position, not as an individual, but as an Indian feminist, say. So this is what I'm trying to do, just a very brief account of some dense discussions. This was among African scholars. And we're also very interested in, that is in South Asia, we're very interested also in knowing more about Latin American feminism, of which I think all of you would be much better equipped to talk about than I am. But I was interested to learn that the term gender has been seen as problematic here too, here meaning in this world that I'm simply going to call Latin America. I'm aware that this is it's a term I'm going to put in suspension. I know there are a lot of debates about using this term, but the term gender has been problematic in this region too, I learned, for a different reason. So in a very interesting essay I read on Latin American feminist philosophy and politics by someone you may all know very well, Stephanie Rivera Berruz. Please forgive my pronunciation of all Spanish words. I don't need to apologize for using any African terms whatsoever, because I'm assuming that nobody here is going to correct me. I may be wrong. So Berruz states that gender entered the region with the translation of Gail Rubin's, she's an American feminist. Gail Rubin's scholarship was translated into Spanish, and according to Berruz, gender entered the region with this. The term was translated into Spanish as género, whose direct translation is more akin to genre or species. This is what Berruz says. Latin American feminists have contested the legitimacy of gender as a category of feminist analysis, for they see it as depoliticized and appropriated by states and funding agencies. These feminists have generally used the concept of patriarchy, preferring it because it offered a framework grounded in ideological and socioeconomic conditions that allowed for articulating the cause of women's oppression. The interlinked ideas of decoloniality and translation are thus central to Latin American feminist thought. And drawing on Sonia Alvarez, Berruz draws our attention to the understanding that difference emerges as a rich terrain from which to engage others. This is a very useful idea, that you don't engage with others, you don't have a conversation because you are standing on a space where you agree on all the concepts. Rather, you engage from the space of difference. I think this is a very productive idea. And she draws our attention, Berruz, to the understanding that difference emerges as a rich terrain from which to engage others. And this difference refers to differences internal to feminism, not merely between hemispheres. So I learned again from Berruz that there's a term transloca, which has been coined to indicate both the process of translation, trans, and the material effects of location, loca. And she says that the transloca highlights multiple dimensions that shape conditions of difference. So in this understanding, decolonization cannot occur without depatriarchalization. This brings us to the second theme that I wanted to talk about, contestations over modernity, the legacy of modernity and feminist claims to it. The major part of struggles against patriarchy and the Brahminical order in caste order in South Asia. So I talked about Dalits. I'm not sure how much, please forgive me if I'm explaining too much, but I wasn't sure how much you understand about caste and Dalit. And so the other term, of course, is Brahmin, which, of course, has become also a metaphor in English for many things. But the Brahmins are supposedly they're at the top of the caste hierarchy. And when you say Brahminical, we are referring not just to actual Brahmins, but it's like when we say patriarchy, we're not referring to men, but to an order based on gender. So the Brahminical order refers to an order based on caste hierarchy. So when we think about the legacy of modernity and feminist claims to it, the major part of struggles against patriarchy and the Brahminical caste order in South Asia have invoked the values of modernity as they were presented to us by British colonialism. That is, in order to challenge Brahminism, the values, the supposedly modern values that British colonialism brought to our part of the world, equality, freedom to determine oneself, these were actually used in the struggle against caste against the shackles of a rigid hierarchical caste order. So Indian historian Uma Chakravarti developed the concept of Brahminical patriarchy, which is very, very formative in any work on South Asia. And Brahminical patriarchy indicates that caste hierarchy and gender hierarchy are the closely interconnected organizing principles of the Brahminical social order. The maintenance of this order requires the subordination of the so-called upper caste woman and effective sexual control over her to maintain not only patrilineal succession, but also caste purity, an institution which is unique to Hindu society. Now, from this perspective, what happens is that if you make any critique of modernity, For example, the way Mignolo does, or the whole decolonial framework does, which says that modernity and coloniality are part of a dyad. Modernity comes with coloniality. If you make any critique of modernity as forming part of the coloniality-modernity dyad, it tends to get looked at with suspicion in our parts of the world, because it is seen to give legitimacy to traditional forms of oppression. Indeed, but so the contestations of a modernity arise because there is another view of modernity, another feminist view of modernity, which notes that the cleaning up of uncontrollable forms of sexuality accompany modernity and the values that come with it. Progress, the inevitability of historical forms, the language of rights. Thus, while the language of rights did enable many subaltern sections against indigenous elites, this language, it is argued by many feminists and historians and feminists, and some of them are feminist historians, the language of rights did enable many subaltern sections against indigenous elites, but this language was not uniformly empowering and had devastating consequences for many other equally subaltern groups who were drastically marginalized and disciplined by these new codes, norms, and forms of identity. I will explain this through an example of matrilineal and its abolition. I'll explain that in a minute, in a particular community in the southern state of Kerala in a while. So the argument that this kind of position is making is that, I mean, we might want to think of Walter Benjamin's words. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. That is to say, to accept what comes later in time as necessarily better is to assume the moral superiority of the tendencies that happen to be victorious, right? So simply because it comes later doesn't mean it's better or more progressive. And when you look at sexuality, particularly in the global south, it is impossible to engage with what is called sexuality in contemporary, but I'm going to talk about India, but this is true for many parts of the global south. It is impossible to engage with what is called sexuality in contemporary India without recognizing its passage through the complexity of the practices that were homogenized under the sign of modernity. It is equally important to insist that when you make this kind of critique, it is not an indigenist critique of the West. What is at issue is not discourses of place, but of time. I'll return to this. There's a large body of feminist scholarship suggesting that the social reform movements, as they were called in 19th century India, demonstrate anxieties of control over women, their bodies, and their sexuality, and articulated complex and contested interrelationships between women on the one hand, and on the other, emerging notions of citizen, nation, and community. So, expressions of non-normative sexuality and desire, far from being Western imports, as Hindu right-wing critiques of feminism in India allege, that is, this is all Western. All this non-normative sexuality that you talk about is all Western, it's not indigenous, it's not Indian. This is the kind of critique of feminism that is made by the Hindu right. But what we are saying is that, in fact, non-normative sexualities have much, much older histories which precede colonialism. Scholarship in several fields have shown that earlier forms of sexuality, family, and property arrangements that did not conform to the modern bourgeois patriarchal ideals brought by British colonialism were reconstituted to fit these ideals by a very strange partnership of British colonial institutions on the one hand and modernizing nationalist elites who oppose the British on the other. So let me speak a little bit about matrilineal in a particular community in Kerala, the Nair community in Kerala, and how it was transformed and how it was actually legally abolished. Now, the transformation of matrilineal offers a striking instance of the hegemonizing drive of Victorian norms of conjugality. In the 19th century, nearly 50% of the population of Kerala of different castes and communities were matrilineal in different ways, which is to say, marked by property and lineage passing from mothers to daughters. households, let's take the Nair household, for example. The household consisted of, and this is as recently as the early 20th century, which for you I know is a century ago, for most of you in this room, but it's in my living memory. So a Nair household consisted of adult sisters and brothers living together, and the children of the women by polyandrous relationships. Women had relationships with multiple men. They had children. The children of the women and their brothers, adult brothers and sisters, and the children of the women lived together. That was a household. Now, this was absolutely normal, natural, etc., for the Nair community and in Kerala. But there's been a lot of work on this, on matrilineal, and it has been pointed out by scholars that the matrilineal kinship in Kerala has the unique status of being the only kinship system in the world to be legally abolished. The Malabar Marriage Act of 1896, so it was in the late 19th century, that abolished matrilineal, now when they abolished matrilineal, what is the discourse around it? Why does matrilineal have to be abolished? The discourse is of progress, freedom, individual identity, very much within the framework of wider nationalist debates in the 19th century on so-called social reform, that we're going to reform Hindu society and make it, and reform all these unruly sexual practices, right, which the British didn't understand. And the male nationalist elite was also not at all comfortable with a situation in which in which these kinds of households existed. So the reformers or the proponents of marriage legislation were influenced by the ideology of social evolution in which these features of matrilineal, communal property, polyandrous relationships, and matrilineal descent, these were seen as vestiges of a savage past. Civilization meant that all these very embarrassing features had to be stopped. So what happens is that polyandrous relationships began to be described by British courts in India from the 19th century as concubinage. So you know what a concubine is. A concubine is, so they're assuming the subject to be male and that the male has many female partners who are his concubines. But in fact, what you have is a situation in which monogamy is not the norm. It's simply not the norm for men or for women. It's simply not the norm. But by the time the British come in with their Victorian morality, and of course the Nair male elites were very happy to change this situation and enter the properly modern world where patriarchy is the obvious norm, right? So the ideology of social evolution in which communal property, polyandrous relationships, and matrilineal descent were seen as vestiges of a savage past, the British courts began to use the term concubinage to refer to the ways in which polyandry worked. And this is something, therefore, that the Nair elite, both men and women, began to feel ashamed of. So this is just one example. I'm not going into too much detail. This is just one example of legal and social interventions over the 19th and early 20th centuries in India, explicitly and intimately tied to values of modernity, which gradually disciplined a range of non-normative sexualities and family arrangements. You see this in the context of many other parts of the global south. For example, in the context of Sri Lanka, anthropologist Malati Dialvis studied the famous frescoes. Unfortunately, I thought this is the one image I forgot to add, and you can find it. There's a very famous set of frescoes attributed to the 6th century AD in a fortress called Sigiriya, Sigiriya. These are bare-breasted women who in the frescoes of bare-breasted women. And what happens in Sri Lanka is that there are these endless debates about is this something we should be ashamed of, or is this something, this is early 6th century AD. So have we now not moved away from that point, and should we not now be not celebrating bare breasts? So the question that Malati Dialvis asks is, can the sexual be part of a nation's heritage? And she offers a complex account of the way Sri Lankan nationalism recuperates and recovers these bare-breasted women by desexualizing them. So at some point in the course of the nationalist movement, the breasts are painted over with what look like transparent veils. And once they are properly clothed like this, that's something Sri Lanka can celebrate as part of our artistic heritage. They were not, so what Malathi is saying is that the sexual it seems, can never be part of the modern nation's heritage. There is abundant scholarship which establishes that the delegitimation of homosexual desire and the production of the naturally heterosexual, properly bigendered, unambiguously male or female population of citizens, with the women respectively desexualized, is a process that is central to nation formation all over the globe. There's any amount of scholarship that shows this. Afsane Najmabadi talks about Iran, Iran's long 19th century, as she puts it, who argues that it was the cultural encounter with Europe that produced in Iran the heteronormalization of love and the feminization of beauty. She offers the stark conclusion that the modernist project of women's emancipation in Iran, as she puts it, bore the birthmark of disavowal of male homosexuality. That is to say, that was the way in which women's rights were produced in Iran. So what we're saying here is that, and I'm repeating here, that in the second theme, how modernity becomes something that is so contested. On the one hand, it gives you the arsenal, the ammunition to talk about, for example, Brahminical patriarchy, but on the other hand, it's also a way in which multiple forms of sexualities are disciplined, controlled, etc. And this is true, for example, of non-heteronormative forms of sexual desire in India. So this is a very famous book by Ruth Vanitha and Salim Kidwai, who trace from approximately 1500 BC up to the present writings in Indian languages about love between women and love between men who are not biologically related. It's only in the 19th century, they argue, that a minor homophobic voice that was largely ignored by mainstream society in pre-colonial India becomes a dominant voice. So to reiterate, it's important to insist here that the scholarship that makes this kind of argument is not an indigenous critique of the West. That is, as I said earlier, what is at issue is not discourses of place, here versus the West, it's not that, but of time, modernity versus the non-modern. You notice I'm not saying pre-modern deliberately, because pre-modern implies that teleology. It's the modern versus the non-modern, leading us to the realization that the values of modernity have not been unambiguously emancipatory, have often eradicated spaces of relative autonomy, and produced new forms of subjection. So I want to, at this moment, address the appropriation of the idea of the decolonial by the right wing, actually globally. There's a global appropriation of the term decolonial by the right wing. But I'm going to speak about it from the context of India, where indigenous critiques of something called the West, I've already referred to this at many points in my talk, it's part of a now familiar Hindu right-wing claim to be decolonizing India. But I argue that in India, the use of the term decolonization to assert Hindu supremacy, or it's a Hindu supremacist argument, and it's a project of recolonizing. When the Hindu right wing in India does it, what are they recolonizing from? I see the use of the term decolonial by the Hindu right in India as an ongoing counter-revolution on the question of women in particular, trying to recolonize the spaces liberated by Indian feminist movements since the 19th century onwards. So something like, say, access to legal abortion. It's a limited right in Indian law, but it's there, seems to be under threat, with several references by the patriarchs of the Hindu right to the supposedly falling birth rate of Hindus. The implication is clear that Hindu women, and I will always put Hindu in quotation marks for reasons I cannot go into right now because we don't have time, but I'm happy to expand on that later. But the implication is that especially so-called upper caste Hindu women are expected to produce more sons for Mother India, for Bharat Mata, as they call it. So access to legal abortion is being challenged by this scare that there's a falling Hindu rate of birth, which is not true. Second, the freedom to choose one's sexual or romantic or marriage partner has been under threat with a campaign called Love Jihad. Jihad refers to, it's a term that I think everyone knows is used in the Islamophobic universe, but jihad, of course, actually means a struggle. In Islamic philosophy, it's about a struggle with oneself to better oneself. But there's this campaign from the Hindu right called Love Jihad, which propagates the widespread rumor that there exists a systematic campaign involving Muslim men seducing Hindu women to convert them to Islam. This accusation is unfortunately palatable for families of all communities because no family wants an intercaste or interreligious marriage. Endogamy is one of the key elements of marriage in India. Now, what did protect adult choices were the Constitution and the law. But this has become increasingly unreliable because in the last 10 years, the law has also been shaped in order to perform the function of maintaining Brahmanical patriarchy. So if, for example, you have a law which was passed by one state in India, ruled by the current dispensation, but now this law will be replicated in other states. It's called the Uniform Civil Code of a particular state, Uttarakhand. The most revealing provision of this law is the surveillance over and state control of what are in India called live-in relationships. That is to say, relationships that are not marriage, legally marriage, two people living together. And this law forces you to declare yourself to a registrar who will grant or not grant permission after a thorough inquiry for you to live together. Failure to register such relationships is a criminal offense. So this law is there now. It exists in India. It exists for everyone from that state. But it's gradually going to be passed by other states. Several court judgments on various... So what I'm talking about now, I want to remind you, is that when the Hindu right talks about decolonizing and de-westernizing, they're really talking about recolonizing spaces that were, in a sense, transformed by feminist interventions over a century. So we found threats to the right to abortion, we find threats to the sexual autonomy of women in particular, but also men. There have been several court judgments on various matters over the last 10 to 15 years where the term sanctity of marriage has been used as something that the courts must protect. And it sees the reinsertion of women into the patriarchal family, and we see this in many, many spheres. For example, there was a senior Hindu right-wing journalist who, a few months ago, this is what he asked at an event. Is Simon's feminism better or Savitri's feminism, who brings her dead husband back to life? Simone refers to the Beauvoir. Savitri refers to a mythological figure. There's another very famous Savitri of the 20th century, Savitri Bai Phule, but that's not who he's talking about. He's talking about the mythological figure, Savitri. I'll explain this more in a minute. He also went on to say how positive the ancient text Manusmriti is from a woman's perspective, because in the Manusmriti it is written, he says, that no decision can be made without her permission after she enters her in-law's household. 2 points are notable from the perspective of my recolonization argument. First, the reinsertion of women firmly back into the patriarchal family, the husband's family particularly, as wife and daughter-in-law. Even feminism is indicated by protecting your husband's life, because what this mythological figure Savitri did was that with her sheer chastity, the power of her chastity, her loyalty to her sexual loyalty to her husband, she brought her dead husband back to life. So that is apparently feminism. Secondly, more significantly, Simone, as a Western feminist, is counterposed not to actual feminist inspirations from our subcontinent. As I said, Savitri is also the name of a very well-known anti-caste and a feminist crusader called Savitri Bai Phule. But the counter-icon that is offered is the very essence of a recolonizing Brahminical and patriarchal ethos, Savitri, the mythological figure who brought her husband back to life by her steadfast chastity. It is clear that whatever the Hindutva project calls decolonizing is in fact a recolonizing project. There is some degree of superficial de-Westernization, replacing of English with Hindi and Sanskrit, for example, but it masks a project of Brahminical supremacy and, in addition, devastating capitalist transformations for the private profit of mega corporations. So I will conclude this section on the contestations over modernity by drawing our attention to a different mode of reclaiming modernity by Rivera Kusikanki. Do forgive me for mispronouncing her name. She deploys an Aymara idea, which is spelled as CH''IXI, Chiksi. The Aymara idea of something that is, and the reason I'm using these terms is that we use a lot of European and German terms, and we try to learn the pronunciation of Foucault and so on and so forth, and gouvernementalité and so on. And I feel we have to take that step of making mistakes. I don't know the Aymara language. Nobody around me speaks it. I've never heard it. But the more we speak about it, the more these will become parts of our discourse. So forgive me for, it may seem a little, please understand that it's not arrogance that makes me still say these words. It's an attempt to step into unfamiliar terrain and learn from it. As I said, this is the third task of doing thought from the Global South, right? To try and listen to conversations. So she uses this Aymara idea of something that is and is not at the same time. This is how she describes it. She says it's both white and its opposite black. So the Chiksi combines the Indian world and its opposite. This is the other Indian world, not my Indian world, but the Indian world, and its opposite without ever mixing them. And this concept expresses the existence of a society, she says, with the parallel coexistence of multiple cultural differences that do not extinguish but antagonize and complement one another. The modernity that emerges from these relations, she says, is a more organic one than imposed by the elites, who merely ventriloquize theory from the north. What would such a modernity look like in concrete terms? Why do we feel compelled to call it modernity at all? Is precisely something that needs more conversations. Now I come to the last quarter of my lecture. And I have two sections, one on citizenship and the economies of care. And one, the final section is, well, I'll come to that. So why is citizenship a feminist issue for feminism from the Global South? The answer, because citizenship is primarily based on proof of birth in a heterosexual patriarchal family, an institution that structurally undergirds caste, class, and gender injustice. So we tend to think of citizenship as a modern ideal that gives you rights. But citizenship has a dark side, which is the refugee and the migrant, the non-citizen. But citizenship is also an issue for us as feminists because the source of citizenship is the heterosexual patriarchal family. You have to show your parentage at some point or the other in that family. The structure and ideology of the patriarchal family is best illustrated by reactions to the growing feminization of migration flows, both internal and external, and increasing flows of single women migrating abroad as independent laborers in search of better lives for themselves and their families. So this is a phenomenon that feminists of the Global South are very aware of, that there's a feminization of migration flows, and single women are migrating abroad as independent laborers. Now, what happens is that one response, especially from the Global North and from feminists of the Global North, has been to frame such movement in terms of trafficking. But what many feminists of the Global South have been saying is that the notion of trafficking in persons has become closely linked to the abolitionist position on sex work. It has acquired great clout and visibility internationally, with feminists from the first world leading anti-trafficking campaigns. In their definition, trafficking is linked to migration, and trafficking is understood as forced migration. But many feminists, especially from the Global South, are critical of these anti-trafficking initiatives, particularly of the US Anti-Trafficking Act 2000. They show how these initiatives collapse the distinction between voluntary sex work and coerced trafficking, treating all cross-border movements of women as coerced, thus excluding these women from legal recognition and casting their families as criminals. There is also militant opposition from sex workers themselves to anti-trafficking policies being promoted by Western and South Asian countries and by some feminist and human rights groups. So I found it very interesting, a conceptual move that the feminist legal scholar and activist from India, Flavia Agnes, has suggested a very interesting move from the point of view of feminism, a conceptual move away from the notion of a vulnerable subject to that of the risk-taking subject. She argues that migrants, including those in sex work, exercise agency, demonstrate decision-making abilities which seek to maximize their own survival as well as the survival of their families. Women's perceptions of themselves and of their so-called exploiters provide a further challenge to the traditional and stereotypical images of victim and perpetrator, women as perpetual victim, right? For example, while the dominant image of women in the sex industry is that of subjugated, dominated, objectified, and abused persons who are preyed upon by conniving men, studies of women in the sex tourism industry in various countries reveal that women do view it as an arena of negotiation to improve their own economic situation. So what comes from here, from this position, from this kind of argument that challenges the idea of forced trafficking and migration as a problem? Migration is the problem, it seems, right? Many scholars and activists have suggested that we need a political practice that is, as feminists, we need a political practice that questions the very legitimacy of the sealed national borders which we have come to take for granted over the past century. National border regimes must be opened up as well as labor markets organized through them. There must be an end to discrimination based on one's nationality. These are the demands of the growing group of no borders activists across the world. A radical political practice is called for. Struggles for a decolonized commons is the way No Borders activists put it, that challenge the barbed wire borders of nation states. We need to question citizenship by birth also from the perspective of the biological familial foundation of citizenship, as I mentioned. Compulsory heterosexuality undergirds most forms of identity. Caste, race, and community identity are produced through birth. But what we fail to note and criticize adequately is that birth in a particular kind of family also determines the quintessentially modern identity of citizenship. So what if we challenged as feminists the notion of birth as the basis for citizenship? We would then be forced to think of alternative sources of citizenship rights. One is through claims to family ties by heterogeneous and fluid forms of intimacy that refuse to be legible to the state. What if we said multiple kinds of families can be the source of citizenship, not just the patriarchal heteronormative family? But equally, what happens is that I think we can start thinking about, and we should start thinking about citizenship as based and located in the place of labor, not of birth, a place where you live and you work. And this is an argument that has been made for Africa, for example, by Mahmoud Mamdani, who says that citizenship should not be based on some notion of the past. We share 4,000 years of common history. So what happens when you make that kind of argument is that all those who don't fit into that common history have to be ethnically cleansed. And ethnic cleansing is a feature of modern nation states. He says citizenship should be based on a vision of the future, not of the past. That is, what does this group of people want of this place where they're living for the future? So citizenship as based on ideas of the future, not of the past. Finally, a practice feminist practice from the South includes degrowth feminists located in the North. So this is, by the way, a poster. This is a line of poetry from Indian feminist Kamla Bhasin. You see it written in Hindustani, in Hindi, in Urdu, and then at the bottom you can see it in English. I am not the wall that divides, I am a crack in that wall. What she's actually saying is, मैं सरहद पे बनी दीवार नहीं, मैं उस दीवार पर पड़ी दरार हूँ. I am not the wall that stands at the border, I am the crack in that wall. This is the no borders kind of position that we need to take, where you celebrate the breaking of barbed wire nation states. Finally, a feminist practice from the South includes the degrowth feminists located in the North. So I hope I have sufficiently complicated the idea of the global South. It's not a geographical space. And the degrowth feminists located in the North are very much, in my understanding, part of the discussions on the global South. Degrowth philosophy rejects GDP as an indicator of economic well-being and proposes a framework for transformation to a lower and sustainable level of production and consumption, a shrinking of the economic system to leave more space for human cooperation in ecosystems. Feminist degrowth insists on recognition of care work as work, and our economies that are in the grips of the growth paradigm, founded in heteropatriarchal capitalist principles, must be led towards emancipation. This is the feminist degrowth principle. Feminism, in conclusion, speaks up at the most inconvenient times. During the armed conflict between India and Pakistan in mid-2025, when a violent jingoistic atmosphere prevailed in the region, within 2 days, a signature campaign resulted in 1,000 individual feminists and 10 organizations from both sides of the border who issued a statement that condemned war. That statement read in part, I will only read very few small sections from it. We as feminists, and imagine saying this at the height of the worst kind of jingoistic and militarized and war celebratory atmosphere that the mainstream media and the government had created. We as feminists are fundamentally anti-war and anti-militarism. This is feminists from both sides of the border. We denounce the war economy that thrives on violence and destruction, and the deeply patriarchal structures that fuel and sustain it. The past year has been marked by a surge in global violence, with devastating images from Gaza and other conflict zones becoming a daily occurrence. Indian and Pakistani governments and opinion makers seem uncaring of the catastrophic consequences of war and the immense devastation it would cause. Only those who are manufacturing and selling weapon systems to our governments can benefit from war. We as feminists from India and Pakistan firmly believe that war is never the solution. And Kamla Bhasin's this slogan was very much in the air at that time. Feminist transformation is not one moment of revolution. Feminist practices seep into the groundwater of wherever we are, transforming common sense. Let me conclude with the recent massive successful student protests in India under the banner of the Cockroach Janata Party that resulted in the resignation of the education minister. I'm not going to go into that in detail because it's not directly linked to here, but I want to talk about that space of protest, which was extraordinary in its joyousness and very, very young people. It was called the Gen Z protests, predictably enough, but I'm not very thrilled with that phrase. These were young political people who happened to be mostly below 30, and very much younger than 30, in fact. So what I want to talk about is that this space of protest was extraordinary in its joyousness. I'm using this as an example to talk about the fact that feminism is not one moment of revolution. I do believe that feminist common sense seeps into the groundwater. So over the last 3 or 4 decades, there's been very strong feminist presence in India, either as actual movements and struggles, or conversations, dialogues, conversations among young people, conversations between thousands of teachers across the country and young people, and so on and so forth. The queer movement, the anti-caste movement, all of this has produced some kind of feminist common sense. So in the darkest moment of Indian democracy, we find this protest, which had a very specific education-based demand. But The space of the protest was extraordinary in its joyousness and irreverent mockery of power by young people of all classes and genders. The universe of the protest became a sort of utopian queer feminist space of mutual care and feeding and companionship that went beyond class and caste. I can tell you it is revolutionary and unimaginable in a society of graded inequality, as Ambedkar called it. Very, very casteist society that is India, where people are sitting together and eating and feeding each other and so on. People donated hand fans and the protesters used them to fan one another. Food was brought by people of different communities. Everybody ate together. Young boys went around offering sanitary napkins to women. Shoes and slippers lost in the stampede of the baton charge by police were carefully collected, organized in pairs to the extent possible, and set up at the protest site under a sign that said "Free Footwear." It was a space in which all taboos were breakable, in which people of all genders and classes and ages felt comfortable and safe, jostling up against each other in the humid heat of Delhi's June and July. So many, many reels were made of women saying how safe they felt in that crush in Delhi, which is one of the most unsafe cities in India. Let me leave you with this last incident. One young woman in a reel, laughing, because that was the whole point. This is where the youth of the movement was clear. There were just reels upon reels upon reels, which the mainstream media was not covering the protest at all. It was through these reels that we came to see these things. So there's a reel which shows a young woman laughingly saying to a reporter in Hindi, surrounded by other young people, she says, "I'm here, but I'm tired, I'm having my periods. But kya kare, desh ke liye khoon to bahana padta hai. What to do? One has to shed blood for the nation. I'm having my periods, but what to do? One has to shed blood for the nation." And she laughs, and her friends cheer. So she's not only talking about periods on a reel that millions of people will watch, but in one throwaway line, she punctured the hollowness of the toxic masculinist nationalism, inserting the woman's body and its fecundity at the center. Not blood signifying death, but blood signifying the possibility of new life. And she said this proud, unashamed, amused. I think the CJP protests, the Cockroach Janata Party protests, reflect the ways in which feminist ideas and anti-caste ideas have seeped into the groundwater of India over decades. So to be a feminist is not the isolated achievement of individual women. To be a feminist is to feel part of the history that has produced us. It is to insert oneself into centuries of thick textured narratives of struggles and celebrations that transcend national boundaries. To hear the strains of songs of anger and sorrow and militancy in many tongues. To remember our heroines, our foremothers, the younger people who follow us, break the rules and build new worlds. And above all, to feel an enormous sense of continuing responsibility.
Thank you so much, Dr. Menon, for sharing with us this wonderful keynote lecture of this day. A continuación, le damos la palabra a la doctora Mónica Amilpas García para conducir el intercambio a través de preguntas y respuestas de nuestro público.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Professor Menon, for this inspiring talk. I'd like to highlight a few key ideas in Spanish first. Me gustaría nada más subrayar 3 ideas principales de la ponencia de la doctora que nos va a llevar a la reflexión y a continuación me permitiré abordar las preguntas. Primero, creo que las personas aquí presentes coincidimos, ¿no?, que el feminismo no es solamente una idea universal, sino que tenemos que entenderlo como una práctica situada. No existe una experiencia única de ser mujer, puesto nuestras vidas están atravesadas por la clase social, la racialización, la sexualidad y muchísimas otras desigualdades que pudimos ver que pues se replican, ¿no?, de este lado del mundo y en la experiencia de lo que nos trae hoy la doctora Menon. Importantísimo, el feminismo debe cuestionar las desigualdades, ¿sí?, pero también hacer frente a los límites de la modernidad entendida desde el norte global y sobre todo la decolonización no puede ser posible si no cuestionamos el patriarcado. Tercero, debemos repensar la forma en cómo entendemos la ciudadanía, los cuidados y sobre todo los roles que cada una de las personas afrontamos, pero también los roles de nuestras instituciones. Y que estas preguntas pues, van a ser muy importantes para que a la hora que pongamos en esta práctica el feminismo, signifique para todas las personas transformar desde nuestras prácticas cotidianas hasta nuestras prácticas institucionales. Y en ese sentido, pues podamos entender por qué hablamos, ¿no?, de una migración que se ha feminizado, por qué el trabajo de cuidado se entiende desde esta feminización y cómo podemos romper, ¿no?, estas historias, estas trayectorias para poder pues realmente, ¿no?, transformar las sociedades que habitamos. Ahora bien, me voy a permitir formular las preguntas. Trate de resumirlas. So, we have a few questions. How feminism can confront the rise of conservative governments? The first one. The second, do you think that the different concepts about feminism from the global north versus the global south, concepts about sexual work can be different?
Let's listen to all the questions.
Okay. And the third one, what is your opinion about the concept of trade wife? Trade wife? Yes, trade wife, sorry. And the social media role. Thank you.
And your second question was about how sexuality, can you repeat the second question? The second question, can you repeat it?
Yes. Do you think that the different concepts about sexual work is different from global north versus global south?
Okay. Should I answer these questions first? How can feminism confront conservative governments? Well, what I have tried to show is the way in which if we challenge patriarchy, compulsory heterosexuality, in South Asia, casteism, in other parts of the world, racism, the ways in which we challenge these features is by itself a challenge to conservative governments. Because what happens is that the normality of these features, heterosexuality, patriarchy, racism, casteism, the way it is normalized by conservative governments, feminist challenges to that produce spaces like this for the younger generation. The spaces like the protest that I'm talking about, which was not about feminism, it was not about gender, it was a movement for accountability in the sphere of education. But the forms of protest were feminist, were queer, were, in a sense, utopian, were anti-casteist. So I think our presence and our assertions, and by our I mean feminist presence and assertions, by now it should be clear that when I say feminist, I don't mean just women, I mean anyone who is part of this larger critique of patriarchy. It's very clear that our very presence can transform without knowing, although we don't have a feminist party in most places. But it's not the political party that is being the agent of change. The agent of change is conversations and different modes, and challenge every single time. When 1,000 feminists over the course of 2 days stand up and speak against war in a region which is, it's dangerous to speak out against the government, and yet it did make a difference. So I think the way to challenge is to challenge in every possible way, both publicly as in manifestations, demonstrations, protests, statements, conversations in different places, quieter conversations, etc. And then they all just burst out. So we were so surprised by the form that this movement took, because the subject was something else. But the form that it took was so evidently anti-casteist, Ambedkarite, and so on. So I think that was. Concepts, the concepts from the Global North and the Global South, I hope that I have made it clear that I certainly don't take a position, and I don't think as feminists we should take a position that concepts from the Global North are polluted, not to be touched. Now we will only use concepts from the Global South. I'm not suggesting that. Because I do want us to remember that what we are calling, as I said, the East-West dichotomy forgets that prior to the European Enlightenment, and I will always call it the European Enlightenment, although it has been generalized as the Enlightenment for the world, prior to the European Enlightenment, there were flows of knowledge and practices from between the East and the West. So what we call the West is not produced in the West. So there's this, I talked about the Mediterranean region. Some of you may be familiar with Martin Bernal's book, it's called Black Athena. And what Bernal is saying is that if you look at the Mediterranean, he says that prior to the European Enlightenment, it was very obvious that Greece had a closer connection to Egypt, that what you see as Greek civilization and ideas were coming also from Egypt. So it was coming from North Africa. But once the European Enlightenment comes into place, Greece becomes seen as completely white and the source of European superiority. So what I'm trying to say here is that we do not need, feminism as such is a term that comes from the Global North. So we should not replicate by mirror image the superiorist kind of posturing of Eurocentrism. The idea is not to say we are better, we are purer, we have better ideas. It's just that, as I said, we want to privilege location, time and space. So Kant's ideas have a certain space, have a certain importance, but as the ideas of someone located where he was and in the context in which he was, and we can think about whether those ideas make any sense to us. So I think I would not separate out the concepts in that way, but I would say for some time we need to focus on recovering concepts from the Global South that we could use to have conversations with one another. Tradwife, what do you want me to say about tradwife? So I find it, I mean, if you look at tradwife reels, as you can see, waste a lot of time watching reels. Tradwife reels are mostly women in their 20s. I'll say, come back to me 10 years from now. Tell me how you feel when your children are grown up and have left the house and your husband has got on with his life and you have nothing of your own. I'll talk to you in 10 years. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. I have two questions. First one, how can we confront violence against women nowadays? The second one, how can our institutions support care without losing a critical perspective?
The second again?
Okay, how can our institutions, the university, support care without losing a critical perspective? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, violence against... Okay, so violence against women, I think every society is struggling with this in different ways. Let me say that one of the ways which I find possibly least useful is our dependence on the law to deal with sexual violence. So if I can give you, which is not to say that there should not be rules and regulations. I distinguish between rules and regulations which are formed by smaller communities. And by communities, I do not mean communities of birth. I mean a community like this, a university community, for example. So let me give you the example of India. There was a Supreme Court judgment which mandated that all institutions of work should set up committees to deal with sexual harassment. And as a result of that judgment, which was called the Visakhapatnam judgment, many universities in particular set up sexual harassment committees. And because universities, in the last 10 to 15 years, universities have become very beleaguered spaces, both in India and globally, in the US also, beleaguered spaces. But before that, universities were actually the epitome of how democracy could work, because it's a small community, and you can, so the sexual harassment policies that were developed by intense conversations among students, faculty, non-teaching staff, and every university came up with different kinds of principles which were suitable for that university. 2013, the government passes a law against sexual harassment. All these committees become defunct, and now there's one law that covers sexual harassment for all working spaces, factory floor, university. There are different kinds of spaces, right? So when you confront violence against women, I think we have to fight at two levels. One is we have to fight to, in India, we have to fight to restore, but in other contexts, we have to fight to set up more local, community-based rules and regulations to deal with sexual harassment and violence, because sexual harassment is different between an employer and a worker, and different between a professor and a student. And the whole question of consent and so on are much more complicated in different cases. So I would say we need to do that. That's one thing. We need to struggle. It has to be part of our movements to have more local-based rules and regulations. But we also have, the second thing, is we have to work at ground level on a daily basis wherever we are to change perceptions of what constitutes consent and what constitutes sexual harassment. And these are very small, everyday things, but it's difficult to do. Not laugh. Supposing there's a situation in which certain kind of misogynist or heterosexist jokes are being made, you don't speak up because you look like such an idiot for being so self-righteous, and you don't know how to say, I will not listen to this, right? So, I mean, that's a very simple example, but to deal with violence, we have to work at the level of, and so when I think of this space, the Cockroach Janata Party space, we are all astonished that so many women were saying we felt so safe, because Delhi is not a safe city at all. And yet they felt safe in this crowd because these are people who have actually thought about this, young people who have thought about this and tried to work at it. How can institutions support care without losing a critical perspective? Well, always, I'm not sure what exact critical perspective on care there is, so if that person would like to explain it a bit more. But at the moment, I'm going to just say how institutions can support care. The fact is that care work is almost 100% feminized. We know this. And it became very clear during the pandemic. It became very obvious during the pandemic that care work is feminized. That's why the degrowth feminists are talking about taking care work seriously. Now, the care work, the feminizing of care work is based on the sexual division of labor, right? There is a naturalized sexual division of labor by which women perform productive work, but they also perform, and they almost exclusively perform reproductive work on an unpaid basis. This reproductive work is not just producing biologically the next generation of labor, reproduction of labor in that sense, but also reproduction of labor power, because you're running the systems that enable workers to go back to work the next day. That work is unpaid for, it's not counted as work, and censuses often don't treat it as work. When the census taker comes, and this is, I think, a fairly global phenomenon, when the census taker says, what work did you do today? Many women tend to say, nothing. I was just at home. I was just at home. So this very same Kamla Bhasin, whose poster I showed you, has a Hindi poem in which a man says, my wife doesn't work. And then he describes all the things she does in the house. She goes to collect water, she makes wood, she cooks, but she doesn't work. So institutions, I think, at a very basic level, could support care work and challenge the sexual division of labor. For example, I think all workplaces should have childcare spaces, not just where women work, but everyone, because children are not produced by one body. We tend to forget that, right? Where there are women, there should be childcare. Why? Wherever there are human beings who breed children, there should be childcare. So I think childcare facilities, these kinds of parental leave situations, there are multiple ways in which care work can be taken seriously as something that is the responsibility of all human beings. Well, I don't know with care work whether we should lose a critical perspective. So I'm not clear what the question means, because I don't understand what a critical perspective on care work can be, except what I said, that care work is feminized. So once you say that, then that's our critique.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Menon. Thanks for sharing with us, Dr. Menon. It's a pleasure. Agradecemos a todos los presentes y a continuación procedemos a la entrega de la medalla conmemorativa del 75 aniversario de nuestra facultad y el reconocimiento a la profesora Menon. Integrantes de nuestro panel y a todos los asistentes, a quienes también se conectaron a través de redes sociales, la asistencia y participación en este evento. Manténganse al tanto de nuestras próximas actividades y que tengan un espléndido día. Gracias.